Before there were sold-out stadiums, before there was a moonwalk, before there was a king of pop, there was a 2-bedroom house on the corner of a working-class street in Gary, Indiana, with 9 children packed inside it like a secret waiting to be discovered. What happened inside those 4 walls would shape not just one boy, but an entire family for the rest of their lives. And decades later, the people who lived it are still trying to make the world understand what really went on behind that door. Gary, Indiana, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, was not a place built for dreams. It was a steel town, loud, gray, and unforgiving, the kind of place where a man worked with his hands until they bled just to keep the lights on. It was into this world that the Jackson family lived, 9 children under one roof, sharing bunk beds stacked 3 high, sharing bathwater, sharing everything they had because there simply wasn't enough to go around. But inside that crowded little house, something was quietly taking shape. It didn't look like destiny. It looked like a family finding joy in the only currency they had plenty of: each other. To the neighbors passing by, it was just another crowded house on a crowded street, no different from the dozens of others lining that same block. Nobody could have guessed that the sound occasionally drifting through its thin walls would one day fill stadiums on every continent. Nobody could have known that the boy sleeping on the bottom bunk, tangled up with his brothers, would eventually become one of the most recognized faces on the planet. Destiny, if it exists at all, rarely announces itself. It simply waits quietly in ordinary rooms for ordinary people until someone decides to work hard enough to meet it. Long before record deals and stage lights, music lived in that house the way oxygen does, unnoticed until you realize it's the thing keeping everyone alive. A mother's voice humming old country hymns while washing dishes, children falling into harmony without even trying, because harmony was simply how that family spoke to one another. It's easy to imagine the Jackson sound beginning in a studio. It didn't. It began in a kitchen with a broken television and nothing else to do but sing together until the walls seemed to hum along. Then came the guitar, an instrument that wasn't meant for small hands, borrowed in secret. A string snapped, and a father's anger that, instead of ending the experiment, accidentally lit the fuse for everything that came next. What began as mischief turned into rehearsal. What began as rehearsal turned into obsession. And what began as obsession turned into a family orchestra assembled not by choice, but by circumstance. And by a father who saw something in his sons that the rest of the world hadn't yet noticed. Every family has its wild card, the child who cannot sit still, who turns a quiet room electric just by walking into it. In the Jackson household, that child grew into something no one quite expected. He watched the greats, the sharp spins, the sudden stops, the way a performer could make 5,000 people forget to breathe. And he didn't just imitate them. He absorbed them, rearranged them, and gave them back to the world reinvented. It wasn't taught. It couldn't be taught. It was instinct wrapped in discipline, talent sharpened by repetition, until the boy who used to hide under beds to avoid trouble became the same boy who could freeze an entire room simply by stepping into a spotlight. His brothers noticed it before anyone else did. There was no jealousy in it, only a quiet, growing certainty that something extraordinary was living under their roof, and that their job now was to help carry it into the world. By the time the family act began drawing crowds beyond their own neighborhood, something had shifted. What started as children performing for the kids who gathered outside their windows had turned into something the whole town began to talk about. Local talent shows led to bigger stages. Bigger stages led to nightclubs that technically should have been off limits to children that age. And nightclubs eventually led to a van pointed towards cities far larger than Gary had ever prepared them for. There was no map for what they were doing. No blueprint, no manager, no formula. A father convinced his sons carried something rare, and a group of brothers willing to rehearse until their voices cracked and their feet ached. Because the alternative, staying in Gary, watching opportunity pass them by the way it had passed so many others, felt far worse than exhaustion. When word finally reached the ears of a record label built on discovering exactly this kind of talent, it wasn't luck that opened the door. It was thousands of hours of preparation that most people never saw, condensed into a handful of minutes that convinced strangers this family was different. The audition that would change everything almost didn't feel like a beginning at all. It felt like the payoff of years already spent working toward a moment they didn't yet know was coming. But greatness rarely arrives without a cost, and in this family the cost was childhood itself. While other children were riding bicycles down quiet streets, joining Little League teams, or losing themselves in aimless summer afternoons, these children were rehearsing. Not occasionally, relentlessly. Music became less of a hobby and more of a job, and the job began before most kids had learned to read a full sentence on their own. There were no sleepovers, no neighborhood games, no ordinary rites of passage. Instead, there were long drives in a cramped van towards smoky clubs in unfamiliar cities, opening for performers twice their age, learning showmanship the way other children learned multiplication tables. It bred something rare, an artistry most performers spent a lifetime chasing, but it also bred an absence, a hollow space where an ordinary childhood should have been. and that absence would follow the most talented among them long after the crowds went home. At the center of it all stood a father whose method was simple and unyielding. Excellence was not encouraged, it was demanded. Rehearsals were not optional. Mistakes were not shrugged off. In a neighborhood where the wrong turn could mean prison or worse, discipline wasn't cruelty in his mind. It was survival, dressed up as strictness. To the children living under that roof, the line between the two was not always easy to see. Fear and love can occupy the same house, sometimes the same room, sometimes the same moment. A single look could silence an entire room of boys. A misstep in rehearsal could mean consequences swift enough to leave a memory that outlived the bruise. Years later, when the world would ask whether that discipline had crossed into something darker, the family's answer was rarely simple. It was defensive, protective, sometimes conflicted. The answer of people who lived two versions of the same story at once. The version where they were being prepared for a future no one else could see coming, and the version where a small boy occasionally trembled at the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Being the most gifted child in an already gifted family comes with its own quiet burden. While his brothers found normalcy in numbers, safety in being one of many, the most talented among them stood increasingly alone, watched more closely, expected to carry more, forgiven less. He would later say, in his own words to the world, that he never truly had a childhood. That statement would ripple through decades of headlines, biographies, and documentaries, dissected and debated by strangers who never once set foot in that small house in Gary. But those who did live there understood something the headlines rarely captured. That the loss wasn't sudden or singular. It was gradual, traded away rehearsal by rehearsal, city by city, until an entire era of childhood had quietly vanished in exchange for a spotlight the rest of the world could only dream of standing in. There is an assumption people make about child stars, that fame arrives and childhood simply continues alongside it, just louder, just richer. The reality inside that family tells a different story. Success didn't add to their childhood, it slowly replaced it. Hotel rooms became more familiar than backyards. Bandmates became more familiar than classmates. Applause became more familiar than the ordinary, quiet boredom that most children take entirely for granted. Even protection, when it came, arrived wrapped in restriction. Security posted at hallway exits wasn't just about safety from outsiders. It was about controlling every variable in an environment that adults had decided was too dangerous to leave to chance. For some of the brothers, structure like that felt like reassurance. For the most visible among them, it sometimes felt like a cage built out of good intentions, one that never fully came down even after the tours ended and the cameras stopped following him into every room. Families protect their own, even when the truth is complicated. And this family is no exception. When the world paints their father as a villain, when documentaries reduce him to a single cruel archetype, the siblings' instinct is to push back. Not necessarily because every memory was gentle, but because reducing a complex man to one dark headline erases everything else he gave them. Ambition, structure, a way out of a town that swallowed so many others whole. It is a loyalty forged not from denial, but from context. The understanding that survival sometimes looks different from the outside than it feels from within. What strangers call trauma, the family often calls the price of the dream. Neither version cancels the other out. Both live in the same house, the same memories, the same unresolved silence. Decades later, the small house on that Indiana street still stands as a symbol, not of fame, but of the improbable distance between where they started and where they ended up. 9 children, one crowded home, a father with a relentless vision, and a mother whose voice taught them harmony before the world ever gave them a microphone. What emerged from those walls wasn't just a musical dynasty, it was a case study in what talent costs when it arrives too early, wrapped in discipline too strict, inside a childhood too short. And perhaps that is the real story behind the headlines. Not a family destroyed by fame, but a family forever shaped by the sacrifices it took to get there. A story of brilliance and burden, love and fear, discipline and dreams, all tangled together in a house that was far too small to contain what would eventually come out of it. Even now, when the surviving siblings sit down to talk about those years, you can hear both truths competing for space in the same breath. Gratitude for a discipline that built something extraordinary, and grief for a softness that discipline never allowed. That tension is not a contradiction. It is simply what it means to grow up inside a dream large enough to swallow an entire childhood whole. If this story moved you, remember, behind every legend is a family who lived the parts the world never saw, and their story deserves to be heard in full, not just in headlines,